go ahead and do. Welcome everyone to the August meeting of the Lake Forest Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tyler. Go to quick introductions. Chair. Amy's on
Yeah,
the phone.
Should we do Zoom introduction?
Yeah, sure.
First?
Amy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Hi, I'm Amy Hannigan. I'm vice chair of the board and what else? And I'm leaving tomorrow for my son's wedding this weekend. So I'm a little distracted.
Richie?
I am Richie. I'm a member of the board. I am a community member, resident of Lake Forest Park, and I live nearby, walking distance to the new park.
Nice.
Eric, do you wanna?
I'm Eric. I'm a Parks Board member, and I've been a resident of Lake Forest Park for 13 years.
He is our high school representative.
My name's Alex. I am a Parks Board member, Lake Forest Park resident.
Tyler. Go ahead.
Steve, been at the third meeting. Been a Lake Forest Park resident for 3 years now. I was a pandemic transfer, so really enjoy it.
I'm Lori Bodie. I'm a city council member.
Sure. I'm Amber McCusick, and I work for DCG Watershed, landscape architect.
Yeah, so Chuck McDowell, also a landscape architect with DCG Watershed. I'm calling in from Missouri tonight, but live in Seattle, and I've met a couple of you before, so good to see you all.
And you're Corey.
Corey Roach, City of Lake Forest Park.
Everybody knows Corey. Thanks for joining us all.
I actually just.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, yeah.
Actually,
Sorry.
it was really fast.
So we'll jump into the formalities, I guess. We have the agenda. Hey there, come on in. We just got through a round of introductions, so you're just in time. No, please.
Al here.
Great.
So my introduction is Josh. I'm Josh.
Perfect. We can take a look at the agenda that Corey sent out. I think she sent out a few days ago, and I think the recent copy, there's one here if anybody needs it. Any comments on the agenda or questions or a motion to approve it?
Move to approve.
Any seconds? All in favor of the agenda as written?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? We can talk about it. Okay, let's move forward with this agenda. It's approved. Then speaking of the next approval item is the minutes from the last meeting, which were attached. I just lost them. There they are. Any questions, comments, or updates to those prior meeting minutes from anyone?
I have a question about something on the minutes, not the minutes themselves. So is this the appropriate time, or should I save it for old new business?
Probably old new business.
Okay.
It's more the content, but if
Sure.
this looks accurate, then
Yeah.
we'll move forward with these with the motion and second. Okay. Anybody want to second that? Second. Great. With no other comments on the minutes from the July meeting, all in favor of approving those as written? All right. Great. Any opposed? I see none. So great. Those are approved. Thank you. Thanks for writing those up, Corey. Okay, next on the agenda is, the whole point. The lakefront property overview and discussion with consultants. So now we can get to it.
Great. Well, thanks for having us today. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Okay. Well, coordinators. Liquor on it.
Can't really stop it.
This is like, guess what time now?
We have not filled up David.
I think this is product placement.
We're paying for the new park. Did you?
This is for the kids, right?
All right, so. Just a couple things, in terms of what I was hoping to go over today, so we did a round of introductions, Chuck and I are representing DCG Watershed here, the team is much larger. And I'm the project manager on the work. Chuck and I are working together to manage what is a pretty robust project, including community engagement, involvement, outreach, a design scope through concept. So as far as an overview of the project, we took a scope of work to council twice. We did get some input from the council on the first round. We incorporated those items and changes. And where we have ended up with that scope is about a year's worth of effort with the intent of figuring out what this project is about, what the community would like, bringing together a number of alternate concepts, refining to a single concept, bringing that to an application for RCO, which is, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the RCO grant program, but it's essentially the state's device for administering a whole bunch of grants, federal and state. And so we, in having experience worked in other states, Washington is great in the sense that they have this one body that administers all of these different programs. That is a 2-year window, and the application is early spring. So if we don't make the application this early spring, it's 2 years before we apply again. And so that is sort of that critical date in our process. And that's why we've got the entire schedule laid out as it is. So when the City of Lake Forest Park went to request for proposal for this project, they did ask for a team that could take the project all the way to construction. But what we know about this park is where it is. What we don't know is what it's going to be. And so in order to provide a scope so that we can get started with the work, not knowing where we're going to go, we don't know what things like construction drawings or construction timelines or permits will be required. And so we opted to write that scope for that first concept phase. So that's where we are. So that's going to take us basically through the end of the year. We'll apply for the RCO grants. We'll put together a full package of information in terms of presenting to the public, presenting to the community, presenting to council, presenting to granting organizations. This is what the project is. And then we start the exercise of here's what comes next. We, as the city has let us know, the intent would be that we keep this momentum going and we move the project forward as much as we can for the community. But we understand that based on what you guys and the city council and the community elect to do with the property, there may be things like the need to fundraise, the need to wait for some of these grants to make decisions. And so while the hope is that the project runs its course and the community, opens a park and the mayor cuts a big ribbon and you guys are all there and it's this wonderful experience. Unfortunately, because we don't know where we're going, we don't know if there's going to be a gap in there. We need to pull dollars together. So my role as project manager is to advocate for the agreement that we have and the process that you guys have identified as critical for your city. So I'm going to act like we've got to make the RCO date. We've got to get things turned around. But that's because that's my role. So if the city or the city council or the Parks Board says we need to take a beat, that's when I can relax the schedule and I'll just keep you guys informed of what the consequences of that would be, what the risks may be. But I'm always going to follow the city's lead from that angle, the city and community and city, the guiding bodies of these two. So just so you know, so if it seems like I'm saying things like, we've got to get this done, it's because that's my job until you guys say that I have a different job. So, okay. So I'm going to go through our timeline, and it is complicated because it's a project schedule for administering this project, but I'm going to hit on some of those key dates.
Can I ask maybe an early question? What do we need to have by that RCO date? What do we need to have done?
Right. So we need to know what the park will look like.
Okay.
Right. And we need to know how much it's going to cost.
Like drawings, what it looks like, or
So, right, we need to have basically a general concept. So right now, have any of you guys visited the property?
We all have.
Wonderful. Excellent. Have they been in the structures? No. Okay, got it. Okay, so we're actually, we've been to the park, but we're, you know, we've been to the site, but we haven't been in the structures either. We're timing our work in the structures for next week after the tenant vacates. So so that'll be a first and exciting one. And you know, we'll start to survey all of that. We know that there's a lot of possibility on that site, and that there's a lot of ways that it could go. You know, there's a number of ideas I think that people have. I think ideas that maybe you have, that council members have, for what would be the best use of this property in terms of how is the community going to use it? How can developing this property be something that adds to the natural beauty of Lake Forest Park? And what ultimately are we doing? There are reasons why we need to understand what we would call the program, which is basically like, what are the facilities and uses that are going to be located there? Because those will dictate a bunch of other things. So for example, this is by no means a suggestion, this is just me pulling some examples out of a hat. If we decide to take the structure and turn it into a Starbucks, there will be requirements for parking, for licensing, for utilities, for fire codes, for all of those things. And those start to move out of that structure and occupy more of the space. We will then have to get people into that, which means getting them through the intersection and onto Beach Drive, and what happens with signage and what happens with lights and things like this. So the more that we decide this is where we want to go, that's when the expertise of the team comes in to say, then these are all of those other things that are going to be required to make this an effective program, and to make sure that we're developing this park and being sensitive to the needs of all of the other things, the adjacent neighbors, the street itself, the infrastructure that's existing, you know, the bus, the sewer line, all of that stuff. So that's where we come in, is to say, you know, here are the things based on what you've said, here are the ideas. This is the impact of each of those, and this is the implementation strategy. And so what we'll constantly do is be moving forward with that objective information to help you guys make a decision as to what you want to move forward. So part of that is going to be through conversations like these, where we talk about, you know, what does the PRAD see as your role? We know that you are tasked with the vision for this master plan, for the agenda, or for the, what is it, the mission for the year? I don't remember what it's called. The work plan. The work plan, yes, for the year. But I'd like to know what that means from you guys. Whether it means that you want to be present in conversations with the community, whether it means that you want to be ambassadors for this project to the community to help to, you know, have small conversations with neighbors, and with friends, with neighborhood groups, and then to bring those back. Or if you feel like, you know, this is more about the vision of the park based on what you've heard and you bring to this room. So do you want to sit back and kind of amplify the community voices through things like the community charrette and our outreach and, you know, our surveys and things that we'll do? Or does that mean that you guys listen and then you come here and we discuss, and that's where the program comes from? Now, we know that there's going to be conversations with this body. We know that there's going to be conversations with the city council. We know that there's going to be regular conversations with the community. And then there's also city staff and departments. Like anything that we do on the site will have to be permitted, and that's permitted through, you know, local agencies. So that's the city's own permitting department. So we'll engage them at the beginning to make sure that we're not proposing things that's not going to pass permit. But there's other layers of that. There's certain things that we do, especially at the waterfront, where we'll have to communicate with the Corps, we'll have to coordinate with Fish and Wildlife. There's numerous layers of this if we choose to get involved in certain parts of the property. And so again, what our job is going to be is to know all that stuff. We've worked on a lot of similar projects. We've worked on projects in this jurisdiction. We've worked on projects on this creek, in this lake. So, you know, there's a lot of experience that we can bring. And then we also will know, if you guys ask a question, the responsibility on our part is going to be to figure that out, lay out some options, and let you know what the impacts of that may be. So we'll facilitate with the public, we'll educate you guys, we'll give you the tools and information that you need to be making decisions. And that's the same with the council. I think one of the things that Councilmember Brody mentioned in the council meeting when Steve, you were being appointed to the board, was that, you know, you guys are participants in the engagement of community members as liaison for, you know, the park system and the park needs and the community's needs for recreation and leisure through Parks and Recreation. And so to that extent, I really want to know what information we can provide to you what's helpful for your facilitation of that role. And then specifically, you know, what you're interested in terms of your role of vision. So, we could skip right to that, or I could go ahead and go through the timeline.
Can I just say, the way I've thought about it is you're developing the materials, but our individual Parks Board members could be like ambassadors to the community. If there's a charrette, they could have a table, because we want the community to feel they can communicate with Parks Board members and have their views amplified through the Parks Board. But on the other hand, I know people are busy, and so I think the role is going to be generally helping out with that, but it will depend on the individual's ability to, you know, raise their hand and say, oh, I'll go to that a community event, or oh, I'll go to that you know, public meeting. So that's kind of my view is it's there's a role, but there's a certain amount of flexibility in it. And of course, I think the materials would be developed by your group, and the board members might have some input on the materials.
Oh, great.
So
Okay.
that's been my vision. I don't.
And I think also, sorry, we're not elected though, so I want to make it clear that in the board, the council still has a final approval.
Oh, yes.
Right, so
Yes.
we're here to help out in sort of that
Yes.
middle layer.
But we value your
Yeah,
recommendations.
Thank you.
You guys are advising the council, like,
Right.
you know, they're taking your recommendation.
Right.
What does the RCO stand for?
Stands for the Recreation and Conservation Office.
Okay. And this is the grant, sort of the body that like doles out money for grants.
Right, so, I've worked in recreation planning for almost 20 years now. And basically there is a lot of available transportation, or a lot of available recreation money, either through transportation programs, through recreation programs, through conservation and stewardship programs, through economic development programs. And many of the states have separate bodies for each of those. Super frustrating. What Washington has is one agency that is basically the clearinghouse for all that information. So the way that money is parsed out is through something called the SCORP, lots of acronyms, the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. And that is basically a giant survey of how people recreate, how they train, you know, how they spend their time, where they spend money, the types of activities that they want to do. And that in many states is separate from RCO. Like, or from the central, you know, grant giving agency. In this case, it's all in one. And so they're educated about what recreational trends are. They are given all this money for these separate agencies, and then they kind of dole it out and take, you know, applications from different communities. There are programs like the Recreational Trails Program that funds trails, but not backcountry trails. There's like, you know, ATV programs that fund that type of trail, but not paved trails. And so sorting through the mess of it is really difficult. The great thing about RCO is that you often end up with an RCO liaison, who is someone that you can call and they can say, this sounds great. Take this part of the project and apply for these two, take that part of the project and apply for this one, and then get your like trash cans and recycling things from this grant. And so that's fantastic help in terms of what we need, but it means that we have to have that stuff figured out. How many feet of trail do we have? How many, you know, areas of recreation and open space do we have? Do we have a green space requirement? And then there's also the city's long-term planning documents that like the PROS plan, the Parks and Recreation Open Space Plan, those that will say your targets. So if we can come up with a program that addresses specific needs where there's funding available and addresses specific things in the Parks PROS plan, and then also we can demonstrate community support and a robust community engagement effort, and then say the city has already invested X dollars by having a consultant look at this and we have a preferred plan, it really looks like we have our, you know, ducks in a row to get some of these grants. And so it puts us in a really advantageous place to, even though they want to fund everything, these are competitive grants. So it is about putting together a good application in a lot of ways. And so
I'll get to the level of completeness that.
Yes.
So hold that question until.
Right. Yeah, our hope would be that we can put together a really well articulated plan that is well positioned for some of these grants that are kind of perfect for it. Because there is the shoreline here, because there is conservation potential, we might be required to do mitigation, there's restoration potential, and there's the proximity to the salmon very extreme. You know, there are a number of things that are already keywords for some of these grant programs. And so some of this will be about what are those things and who are the individuals or interested we can talk to help further those goals. So Forterra was already an instrumental organization in terms of getting this property. They're very well tapped into some of these programs. A letter of support from them may go a long way. We've gotten letters of support from, you know, tribes in the past, from Mid-South Fisheries Enhancement Group, for some of these, like, you know, stewardship organizations who are supportive of things like this. That might be from the Runners Club, it might be from the Backcountry Horsemen, whatever it is, it's about getting to them, getting support in the process. And some of what we'll be going through in this is uncovering who those partners on this project might be, that again can help to build support. And so I think to what the Councilmember Bodie was saying, if you have some of those channels and organizations that you're already part of, where you can start using your existing network and growing it a little bit to really figure out what the community is asking for and what are the groups that might be supportive of certain project goals, then that can be helpful as well. So we're on a bit of a fact-finding mission. We're not even really sure where the outside boundary of this project is. If you imagine, and we're going to do some of this in our, pre-design meeting, which I'll tell you guys about, is walking the experience park. So, meeting in the City Hall parking lot, taking the experience across the 522, looking at the street, looking at the things, that are the entrance to the park. What is the journey like? What does it feel like to stand in that space? What does it feel like to have a group stand in those structures? So what are some of the uses that that's going to lend itself to? And then we'll start to present to you the reality of, if we're directing people here, we may need a sidewalk. If we're putting in a sidewalk, we may lose trees. If we need a front space, then it means contending with the power lines. It means, access and egress. What happens to the relationship between the residential uses on Beach Drive? So there's a number of things that can be overwhelming, but our goal is going to be to, step through those as logically as possible with the representatives that'll be in attendance at that meeting. We can debrief with the rest of the group, and then of course there'll be city council members who are present at that time too. So step-by-step journey, we've got it pretty well mapped out, and it'll mean regular touches with you guys, with city council, with the community. One of the things that we did talk about was what that order would be. And so in the way that the schedule is laid out, we really see you guys as the working group task force to move this project forward. You have your finger on the pulse of the community related to recreational issues. We bring technical expertise and experience with this process. So we want to help you do that job, providing you the information that you need. But then we will also be learning from you guys about how to reach the community and how to, engage them in the exercises that we need in order to run an effective design process. So we'll be working with you guys, then we'll be going to the community, and then we'll be bringing to the council. Here's what we came to the Parks Board with. Here's the guidance that we received. Here's what we brought to the community, and here's the feedback that we got from the community. And then here it is, laying everything out to the council to make final recommendations and ultimately decisions, which is its own effort for sure. So so that's what we have out laid out in the process, and so I can go ahead and share the timeline.
Can I ask one other question about the RCO and sport process that you're talking about? Just for sort of context and expectation setting, I assume that we're not thinking that the entire thing is funded out of those sorts of grants. Do we have like what percent? Obviously, we don't know what the project is,
Right.
as you're saying, so it's hard to put hard numbers on this, but
Sure.
ballpark, how much of a likely project that we would propose might come out of that, and what would wind up looking elsewhere?
So that's a good question. So ultimately, RCO doesn't administer every grant that's available, but they administer several. And so they have really good resources for us to be able to say these parts of the project can be covered. There may be elements of this project that we cannot figure out the grant through RCO to fund. There may also be money that the city is eligible for this project, but it requires matching funds. So even if they're ready to give you $2 million, you have to start with 2. And so demonstration of having those matching funds is pretty critical for being able to get some of those grants that require matching funds. Some are 50% match, some have 0 match, some have 30% match. But again, that's based on what's the program, what is the money coming from? And then there's also outside funding opportunities. So we can look at outside grant applications. We can also look at ways that we can incorporate fundraising through the park design. So for example, you've maybe seen those commemorative brick walks where, you know, people can purchase bricks and then as part of their the park being unveiled, you can go and you can find your family's name and the, you know, the family members' names and things on the brick. Those are sometimes really fun ways to get people involved. It does mean that we have to find where that's going to be incorporated into the design, and then it does mean that we have to sort of price it correctly, because you've got to be able to pay for the work and then some. And if we price them too cheaply, they often sell out, and then people, you know, people don't get the opportunity to do it necessarily, that sort of thing. So it might mean what we have done in the past is basically we've planned for this amount and then gone, oh my gosh, we need to cite like 200 more bricks, and, you know, basically just expanded that class. So there's that sort of thing. So as long as we have some idea of, you know, ways that we can incorporate into the design some of that fundraising. I don't know if there's large donors who would be interested in funding some of the park, or if that's something that the city organization, the city council would be interested in. Sometimes people will come up and say something like that. That may not happen here. It doesn't always. Sometimes that comes with terms that are not desirable for some reason. And so those are all questions that you guys will have to be thinking about, you know, the council that sits down.
I wouldn't worry so much about the fundraising right now, because the goal is to have a really good master plan that has community support, or at least majority community support, and you know, a strong vision for the community to get around. So I think after that, we're going to have to be creative as usual, and the fact that we have expertise available to us, that's an added bonus. So
Yeah, it was more a question in terms of the timing of,
Sure.
you know, we
It could be.
apply, we get the money back.
it could be
I assume that it's not groundbreaking as, you know,
it could be quite a while
Yeah.
before we're
Slow
breaking. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, and with this property, you know, permits will be required if we're doing any work, you know, in water at the shoreline. It might mean permitting through the Army Corps, sometimes that could take a year to 18 months. For example, Twaladees Park, just constructed in Kenmore, opened, you know, shortly after Lock Boom. They were in that project for 6 years and 4 of it was permitted. Right, beautiful, completed, you know, a number of different funding groups. I know they, some was county funding, King County funding, some were RCO grants, some was the city's money, and there were a number of other funding partners that were part of that project as well. So it's possible, there's groundwork laid, you know, implementation of these is often not a short, quick process. But the hope is that, you know, that community support that starts building, then continues, and then, you know, you end up with a really wonderful legacy place that endures, which is often much better than, you know, kind of a quick rush project that maybe doesn't come together as well as it could.
that was the other level of the question of, you know, it will be sustained community engagement from the council, of course, but also the advisory board in some
And
capacity.
it could possibly, depending on the funding, the work could be phased in a particular way, so there could be some public access
Right.
on an interim basis before the whole thing's done, you know. So like Log Boom Park was not completely closed off while they did the work, just the whole waterfront. So could be similar.
Right, and there are sometimes parks, you know, kind of break apart into reasonable pieces. You get most of the park developed, you may pour a slab, and then 2 years later, the picnic shelter is added. So there's, you know, some groundwork that you could do to get it open, to get people excited about it. Once people are standing in the space, sometimes they get really excited about, you know, what comes next. And so you end up with more community support, more people saying, you know, I can give an in-kind donation of from my gravel supply company. And then that helps you get the next grant where in-kind donation qualifies for a match. So there's a number of things that can come from that community support. So it's a really integral, critical part of this process, not just for demonstrating how many people came to the meeting so we can file an application, but actually because the community shows up and helps to get works done.
One good thing is with the log boom improvements recently, I think it gives people concepts to, or ideas to think about. And ours, of course, is smaller and our budget's probably smaller, but still, I think there are some nice features there to think about. And that, to me, the fact they've done that recently is really helpful to our process and keeping it speeding along.
Yeah, definitely go to Logman if you haven't recently.
The advantage we have is we have like one big building, and potentially we could save some other little buildings depending on asbestos abatement and condition and stuff like that. So that's an added feature that they don't have there.
Yeah, there's a lot of character on the site. It's a very interesting property, so it's an exciting process. Okay, so essentially the project schedule. We are working from when we received notice to proceed, which was July 11th, I think, formally. We are meeting with you here now in August, and our hope is that the pre-design meeting would occur in September. So that is.
We have a date for that board.
So we had targeted the week of the 25th.
Yeah, maybe the 25th,
potentially that day.
okay. Yeah, I think we'll do follow up on that, let's to get everyone on board.
Right, we'll send out a scheduling goal for that. We can help with that. That meeting is, so the pre-design meeting is not to come up with what the design is. It's to set the project limits so that we can engage effectively with the community. So oftentimes when we start projects like this, we hear, well, let's ask the community what they want. And so we go to the community and we say, what do you want? And they say, we want pickleball. And then we come back and we say, they want pickleball. And then we get, oh, we're not doing that. And it's like, okay, well, so that's information that we need before we go to the community and say, what do you want? So the best way that we can do this.
I'm just looking for Amy there.
So,
Amy is an avid pickleballer
fantastic.
and fundraiser for pickleball.
Pickleball is great. We just finished up a pickleball court in Kirkland, and they actually had to, after it was finished, the client then asked us for some etiquette rules about, we've got too much competition for the pickleball court. People are saying that it's reserved and we don't even reserve it. And so people are kicking each other out of the pickleball court. So
Amy's in all that.
I am. We don't need pickleball at the new park, so onward.
You have one
So-
redesign somewhere.
So what helps us to know is what are the limits for this project? Is there a cost limit? We can't exceed X. Is there a, no matter what, we don't want to have to go to the court for permitting. Okay, that starts to limit things. Is it no matter what, we need to open by X date? Okay, that may mean that we can't do certain things because there's not enough time in the schedule for this. There's a number, or we have to do something. So for example, we have grant funding for the acquisition, and that has certain stipulations. There's open space requirements, there's limitations on certain uses, those types of things. So we've already got a handful of things that we've got to meet. Not to mention there are codes, like Forest Park has a code, and we've got to adhere to it on this property. There's also things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so anything that we do to retrofit those structures for public use, there's going to be a degree of ADA compliance that needs to be achieved. So again, we'll set out all of those limits that are inherent from just the project happening, but we need to hear from you guys, what are those that are not stated? So for example, is there a deficiency on level of service for some sort of facility? And this is where the city would like to see that facility. So waterfront access is one that was the term in the grant. This was a park that's on the waterfront. The money was received to expand waterfront access. So what does that mean? There are a lot of things that waterfront access can be. And so that's gonna be a conversation about how can we meet the requirement that we have, but do it in a way that meets the city's goals and the city's vision and meets the community's needs. And so again, we can facilitate that process, we can guide those discussions, we can make sure that you guys are educated, but ultimately, the discussion board is you guys, we'll get the community's input, focused based on what those limitations are, and then we'll bring all of that to council for final word.
So 3 big issues, I'll just flag what you already know about. One is the connection to Lion Creek Park, how we integrate it together, and that does have conservation area requirements. But there's a dock there, and I recall one of your concepts was to, you know, somehow have, you know, it's a connected waterfront. So, second thing is parking. You know, which probably will have to be at town hall, but then how does the ingress and egress work? And I know you've thought about that. And then third issue is just the neighbors, namely the Civic Club and the Beach Drive homeowners. We're really going to have to make a special effort to hear what they have to say. Oh, I know, one other issue. The Civic Club, because of silt coming down the stream, the waterfront has gotten very silted in, which isn't even good environmentally. And that is the kind of thing that requires like 7 entities, as you know, to like sign off on a permit. But is there a way to think about it holistically for Lion Creek Park, the Civic Club, and the new park? And that seems so complicated to me to even think about. But I just wanted to flag that because I do think we don't want to necessarily view a limitation being the shoreline as it exists exactly the way it is today.
But the Civic Club is right now, like, trying to get the
Yes.
permits worked out to deal with all of that.
Yes.
That's like one of these,
They're on-
one of these years.
They're on their second effort to,
Yeah.
because I don't, you know, it's complicated, as you know, and you know, if you're not really knowledgeable, it's easy to fall into the pitfall and get delayed, you know, do not pass go.
I would like to know, is anyone a member of this, of the Civic Club? Fantastic, okay, great. So in terms of, I'm not, and so in terms of coordination with them, that they are exactly one of those, you know, they're community members. This park is as much for them as it is for other individuals. And so that is going to be a degree of coordination that would be wonderful to have you guys as liaisons in terms of, are there concerns? Are there, you know, conversation topics that we should know about in terms of the park planning? I think that that's all very helpful.
So Councilmember French is one of those homeowners.
Oh, great.
So I keep telling him on Beach Drive that he has to be the liaison. So, we also have Friends of Third Place Commons. I know this is early for you, which runs community space. And so to the extent there's an interest in community space there, you know, they could be a partner. They might have ideas. And then Lake Forest Park Stewardship Foundation, which is interested in all the environmental features, but also public access and recreation. So
Shore Lake Arts.
oh, and Shore Lake Arts, yeah, yeah,
Senior Center, you know.
yeah, yeah, good point. We have some good, you know, civic community organizations.
I know that Shore Lake Arts wants to do art classes or something in Lake Forest Park so bad, and we just don't
Yeah.
have a space for that.
Yeah, I think having community space, I don't know quite how you organize it or run it or what the nature of the space is, but having community space there, I think would be valuable. Maybe you need security space there too. I don't know. Like police officers might sign up to sit there and be a space in the park, but Kenmore doesn't have anything like that. So
They do not. They have a lot of community space though, and it's very strongly centered on the programming. And so, for example, you know, they have the recreational boating groups, and so those individuals. There's actually at the Qualities Park there is a barn that was the old garage that now was left and was repainted to match the boardwalks. and renovated to be secure storage for a lot of these recreational boating groups. And so actually through the design effort, when the recreational boating groups were identified as, potential supporters of the project, they became enlisted to actually provide guidance to some of the engineers for things like turning radius, or when you're putting those boats in the water. So there are a number of ways that we can get these organizations to have ownership in this process through their participation and guidance. I'm not a recreational boater, and I'm not a recreational boater in this specific community. And so there are needs and things that I wouldn't know about. So it's a great way of enlisting those individuals to say, here's how we recreate here, or here's how we want to recreate here. Are there running groups? Are there youth groups? Are there those types of groups that we can get involved in this process? One of the greatest ways to do that is through the community charrettes. So in this part of the process, we will be doing 2 community charrettes. We have those planned for after the pre-design meeting. So again, we're engaging with you now. We're gonna use what you tell us of these initial ideas, your role in the process. Yes.
I don't know this word, charrette.
Oh, sure. A charrette is basically a workshop that's focused on a design outcome.
Okay.
And so it often is big pieces of paper and markers and things that if you've ever seen photos of like a community planning exercise where they are moving around little buildings on a map, or people with big stickers on things, that's an example of a charrette process. And so sometimes we'll hear things from community members that are we need lighting, we need cameras at the park. And we can either say, okay, well, let's put in lighting, let's put in cameras, or we can say, what is that about? What are you feeling? What's the experience that you're having there that isn't aligning with the experience that you want to have there? And it may be, I don't feel safe. Okay, well, so then how do we create a park where you feel safe? Well, there's a lot of research and design guidelines on perceptions of safety, doing things like activating corners of the park, making sure that we're not creating little hiding spaces, making sure that there's clear view through, opening up sight lines. Those types of things can all get to the reason that this person was thinking that they need cameras and lighting, but it's really in the scope and scale of what you would see in a park space, and it responds specifically to what we know about making spaces feel safer. So that's what we would do in a charretting process, is use our expertise to parse through the community conversation to figure out what the design guidance is that works in this place for this community.
Can I ask a question about that? Because I have participated in charrettes, and I think the most successful ones are ones where there's some concepts or options for people to work with, as opposed to what do you want?
Sure.
And so will you be coming up with some starting points? I can't remember exactly what I thought was successful when I did this, so you probably know better than me. But I just passed that comment on because I think, especially since we're gonna have 2 big community engagements, as much as we can kind of get specific as opposed to more vision in the first charrette, that's what would worry me, and we'll get the big wish list.
Right.
So, and I know you want the limits from the pre-design work, but also conceptually, I know you have some thoughts, so there might be some preliminary, here's a concept, here's a concept, here's a concept, and then you can mix and match the moving pieces of those concepts.
Right.
So that your business, I just said, trying to, get us moving.
I completely agree.
I have a question. Okay, Amber, first of all, I participated in a recent charrette in Bellevue. I don't know if you guys are part of that whole huge redo in Bellevue, but there were over 100 people because it dealt 100 pickleball people were all showed up. It was quite impressive. But what was great is that they did have, as Lori just mentioned, they did have 3 potential ways that the space was going to be distributed, and people were able to, kind of voice their opinions about the 3 different designs. So I thought I think Lori's idea is really helpful. Amber, I'm finding that you are a wealth of information. I'm already in overwhelm about this. I'm like, whoa, what are we doing first? And I would really appreciate it if we could go a little more directly into what are our tasks as the Parks Advisory Board? What are the first things you need us to do by when? Because I'm just, wow. I'm like totally lost.
Overview, and we'll get into there. I'm a bit of a nerd about this stuff, so I tend to get really excited.
I appreciate it. I truly do, but I think we need to have a little more direction. The big picture overview, and then maybe, okay, here's the big pictures, here's the big target dates that we need to be apprised of, and then what do you need us to do first? That would be helpful to me. I don't know about everybody else, but
absolutely. So our schedule for this, in order to meet that important target deadline for RCO applications, and again, that's not the be all end all date for all the grant applications, but it's the major one for our state, and so it would be best in the means of getting, you know, exposure to a lot of funding opportunities is to make that date. So that means that we need to know what we're doing, how much it costs, and roughly when the work would happen, and what the pathway to accomplish that is by the RCO window, which is early spring. So this schedule is laid out to get us from where we are today to a preferred selected concept to move forward by the beginning of spring. So that starts with this meeting, so this engagement point. There's a little bit more to do after we go through this schedule, so we will get to that. We will then be using what we hear at this meeting to prepare for the pre-design meeting and to prepare for the first community charrette. So from the community charrette, we will then take all of that information, pull it together into a recommendation, and present that to council and to get their input. So this is the first cycle, and this is about saying not where things are going to be, but what is going to be. What is the use of this property? Once we know the use of this property, we will then develop 3 well-articulated concept design alternatives, and we will bring them back through that process again. We will bring them first to this body, and we will say, here are the things that we've laid out based on what everyone wants this park to be. They want it to be a community center. They want it to be an arts district. They want it to be a playground. They want it to be a sports complex. Whatever those things that we've heard are, we will put those together into design alternatives, bring them here, and you guys might say, we're not doing a sports complex. And we'll say, great, now we have these. We'll bring them to the community, we'll repeat the conversation, and we'll focus it based on what we've heard from you and what you've heard from the community. We will then take that to the council and say, these are the alternatives that we've laid out. This was the guidance that we've received. This was the feedback that we got from the community. Here is, you know, what we're presenting for multiple alternatives. The council will then give us some direction, and we will take that and we will merge it into a single alternative. And then at that point, that's when we'll start to get one more round of refinements, not through the community at that point. We'll be putting things online. We already have an online open house for where we're starting to build a clearinghouse of information for the public. That's where you'll be able to track project documents, etc. So that's already up in its, you know, elementary format, but as the project keeps happening, we're gonna add things to that. So we'll have our preferred alternative by early spring, and then we'll be pushing that forward to design visuals. That means like, you know, renderings of what the park's gonna look like. It means more specific information about how it's gonna be implemented. And then we'll be moving forward into that next phase.
But I think that if you could have the major milestones where the Parks Board has intersection with the process or opportunity for intersection. One is we're coming to the Parks Board and we want a recommendation from them. That's kind of a mandatory thing. But the other is an opportunity, like here's the charrettes. So this is like a project manager chart,
yes,
but not necessarily. I'm just following up on Amy's comment, which is let us know on the big picture where it is that the Parks Board is intersecting.
So we're intending to come to the Parks Board today. We will see you also, our select members, at the pre-design meeting. We also anticipate that some of you will be present at the community charrettes. We have an interpretive planning session, which will be specific to what's gonna be the identity and placemaking concept of the park. That again will be a small group with the city council and with the Parks Board. And then we will come back in January, which is when we'll actually have those 3 design alternatives pulled together. That's when we'll go to the community in February, and then we'll go to council. And then we will be back in April, which is to say, we've been through this exercise of multiple things. This is our first pass of the refined concept. So now we need to work plan with you guys as to whether the refined concept needs to be tweaked before it goes to next steps. So those are the main touch points. So some of those will be the whole group. That'll be this August meeting, the January meeting, and then the April meeting. And then we've got those other groups, other things where it might be some select members. So if everybody's coming to the community charrette, wonderful. Sounds like some people will be selected, few will be at the pre-design meeting. So that'll be a great exercise. And then so those individuals can, you know, debrief and report back after that, which I think would be great.
And that place making, I'm just sort of trying to keep a schedule roughly in my head, looking at the dates you have there. I see the 1023 charrette. I mean, obviously, I understand from what you said before that all of this depends on a lot, but that one I don't see there. Just the timing of that, is
Sure,
that like
that could be-
November?
Yes, so the interpretive planning charrette, we're intending to have that planning session somewhere the 2nd week of October. And so the goal will be that each of these touch points are going to build onto the story that we bring together into the concepts that are shared with the public.
So the charrette would follow that.
Yes.
Is that okay?
So the public charrette, so the first public charrette, we're actually intending to be in, my apologies, we actually will be earlier that week, essentially right around the same time. So what we want to do is go to the community and say, you know, what do you know about this story? What is the resonant, you know, characters in the story of the park? What do you want to learn about the park? So there will be some of that engagement that happens, but the main time we'll focus on that, and then where you'll actually see the implementation of the interpretive plan will be through those concepts. So
I just want to say the first public charrette, I'm reinforcing what I was saying. I don't want to wait till January to have 3 concepts, right? I think that for our community, a wide open charrette for the first public charrette is not as good as something that has some focus, because we could have 100 people. And there's going to be great community interest, and to avoid having to have like 4 charrettes, I think we have to come in with 3 concepts with mix and match parts, components, so you can kind of do your own composite concept. You know, that's the way I'm thinking of it. So I just want to reinforce that point, because I think our community is I would like the January meeting to be, this is what it's looking like, more than here's 3 options we're still considering, and then we're quick as a bunny wrapping all those up, and you don't have any more input. So I think from our community point of view, I'm reflecting the way things are. It would be better to come in with more detail in the early fall meeting, and then have the kind of refinements you're talking about for the Parks Board and Council, kind of for that second charrette. And then that way we'll have a test, is the direction we're going, because we can't just say, oh, there were 3 options and here's what the council decided. That's just not going to work. So it's good if we find there's like large flaws from our community's point of view, to know from the early 2024 charrette, oh, we need to pause, or people think it's great and the things they want don't fit within the sideboards, right? Because they're too ambitious for our city, you know, and so we can kind of take the heat on that kind of thing. But I just, and it would be helpful for me to have, I'm not a Gantt chart kind of person, so I would rather have just a list of dates if I could. I mean, Corey can pull that together too. But
We'll definitely do that.
the bit, kind of the big milestone dates, it doesn't have to be every.
So,
Send out like, an example of a first community, sure, as well, because I'm getting a sense that what we're doing is getting more and more specific as time goes on.
Yes.
And that first one, to your point, you don't want wide open, but there have to be some examples where it's like, tell me what your priorities are on the list of these.
I'm very aware of the constraints of the property already, like
Yes.
there's not. Our constraints of the property are there, like, so,
Underground parking. road.
yeah.
People are
I have
gonna
a
want,
question. How are we gathering community input? Did I miss that?
No, we haven't gotten to that yet.
Oh, okay. Because we're talking about the charrette, and Lori, I'm with you. I think more specific ideas for the community are great, but I don't know how we're getting the information prior to our first community charrette, which is coming up really soon.
So, yes, so we are in data collection right now. So we're doing research into the codes, into the framework. We have put together a stakeholder engagement plan, which is basically our sequence of how we want to engage with the public. That's been submitted to the city. I'm able to compare the front part. And let me share my screen. Okay. Zoom user. Okay. So currently, this is our online open house. This is the clearinghouse for information. Right now on this page, we've got the minimal information, which is a stay updated. People can opt into email. We've got a contact us link. There's a little bit about the project background. So there's some information about how the project came together, where the project is. There is a rough project schedule. So this is where we are now, which is data collection. We've also started engagement, which is that we've provided an initial toolkit to Corey for the pre-planned community engagement events. So that includes a QR code to link people to this site. We have a poster that provides this information. And then the goal is to be pushing more information through this body, through this, and through those community engagement events. Currently, what we're working on is the template for the poster, for the postcard, and for the survey. Those are all things, though, that we would like the city's okay on. And so that's all laid out in the stakeholder engagement plan to go ahead to be able to move those forward. We are rapidly working forward to what's going to be the framework of the conversation and messaging for charrette number 1. So oftentimes what we ask the community is, in the language that you guys have given us, from we are comfortable with this, we're not comfortable with that, we want something that can be permitted, we have a budget, whatever those things are. And then we say, here's the site, here is what we know about it, here are the things that are going to influence our ability to develop this into a park, here are some of the very real things that we need to understand. Now start to tell us about how you see this park fitting into your community. Do you see it as a place where the community is helping to grow a sense of community through aquatic sports programs, whatever the thing is? That's where we start to have those conversations. And so from that, that's where we'll actually come up with what the program is that will inform those design alternatives. So from this site, for example, we know that there's a number of buildings on site. There was some commitments early on in the grant program that some of those would be taken down. So we know that it's not an option to preserve all of them because we have an open space requirement. So which ones are kept and what's the expense of that? So we understand that if, say, the main large structure is turned into the Starbucks example that we used before, then how does that change? And there will be conversations we have with the public where they bring up ideas that we have not had. We're not members of this community. Sometimes we are in the communities that we work in, but in this case,
I'm concerned that sounds like a really open-ended conversation as opposed to what I was talking about. So
I don't think so. Like,
okay,
she wants what, like, we figure out like what sort of programming
Okay.
is in
and
the
before the charrette, we need to have engaged Corey with the Beach Drive people and given them an opportunity, and the Civic Club people, because if they are just invited to the charrette with the normal public, that's not going to be the best outcome, and they're going to get riled up. So just Hearkening back to how town center was handled and how we don't want to handle this, I think, that's important, as part of this. I think it would be good to have really good visuals so people can see what the property looks like on the website, and to have kind of a really high level survey of exactly the kind of questions you're asking about, because we've had really good success with our planning commission doing surveys, and then they post it on Shoreline Area News 2 or next door, and they get a lot of responses from just, it could be as simple as like 5 to 10 questions about what they'd like to see for the park. But they have to have a good picture of it, because they're not ever going to be able to go and walk the property.
Right.
So I have, the planning commission has used that for both accessory dwelling units, and they just the planning commission designed their own like survey questions, and they got so many narrative comments. And there was a way to summarize all that information. So before the charrette, I think if we want the first charrette to be more specific, it would be good to let people know and let them comment on the website, or send them a link to a survey or something, whatever is easy, but it doesn't have to be complex. I mean, it can be very, very simple.
So, sorry.
In that vein, is it possible to have sort of straw man kinds of alternatives that are sort of at the extremes of what something might be? And then people can say, no, they can't have this, or I want 15% of this.
So a successful activity that we use often is one that we call the design your own park exercise. And we essentially go with what's a feasible program. So what are uses that could happen here? Ferris wheel, not feasible, picnic table, feasible. So we come up with a list of things that we've vetted through you guys, we've vetted through city staff, we've vetted through the code, we've vetted through grant obligations, and then we create those as tiles or as little, toys or buildings. And then we actually ask people to place those on a figure of the park that's been illustrated with the types of constraints that can be represented on a map. So there's a lot of noise here. There's, open views to the neighbors that we want to screen. There's those types of things that we have articulated on a map. And then we ask them to start demonstrating how they would put those together. And so you'll see groups of community members start to have the same types of conversations that we as designers would have, which is, oh, I love this because the view over here is really great. Well, yeah, but then you need to put a tree right here so that so that they feel like they have privacy. So we're getting them involved in a tangible exercise where they're starting to lay out the design alternatives that we'll then articulate in a way that's a scale drawing and that meets code. So it's very focused in terms of the activities that we provide together. It usually is that refining of big to small. Here's where we are, here's the site context, here's what you guys as members of the public are tasked with, and then here's the exercise that we're giving to you, and then can you provide us with your recommendations of what you like. Sometimes there's pieces of string that are used as, to do trails. Sometimes it is markers, sometimes it's little pictures, sometimes it's precedent from other examples. Do we take pictures from Logwood, for example, and they say, I love this on the shoreline, I love this thing. And so they're piecing together these little collages or these little exercises that help us to say, the public gets it. And so it builds confidence. They feel like, many, many times we do these exercises and 70% of the plans look very, very similar. So the public is really aligned. And so then when it's constructed or when they see the plan that we've done, they go, that was my idea, and it's this beautiful process of watching the community come along and be real owners of this park. At some point, we as the design team will go, great. And then we will move on to the next project. And the community is here as owners of this park and as stewards of it. And so they've got to be here. They've got to bring their kids to it. They've got to, bring community groups. It has to be a part of their community and they'll care for it in the long run. So we start that process now by allowing them flexibility to start to influence the decisions, but we don't want to give them a false sense of that because we'll lose trust. So we want to make sure that we're saying, let's engage you authentically. What's the flexibility that the community bodies are comfortable with to actually bring to the public? Is it that they can have benches? Benches, yes, benches, no. Is it that without a doubt we're doing benches? So let's have them pick the benches. So it's that equation. And that's really the guidance that we need from you guys, is to frame that message. So there are some exercises that we have here, which are exactly the types of things that you were talking about, Councilmember Buddy, about what tools and measures can help to improve community participation. Broadly, there's a lot of tools that we can use. In some communities, surveys work great. Some communities, postcards work great. So in terms of what works in Lake Forest Park and what you've seen demonstrated, or what based on your relationships with the Civic Club, your relationships with, Beach Drive, we can have to ask Councilmember French, what reaches people in this community. So some of that, so I've got 5 questions. That would be great to get that input, and that's going to help us to refine that framework of that next step and that survey. But that's what some of this meeting was about. And then we're writing the script for all of the rest of the stuff based on our expertise and then what you guys are helping us to dial in. Okay, so this is next up. So we've kind of gone through the rough overview of the timeline. I can put that in just a quick bulleted list so that it pertains specifically to this body rather than an overview of the whole process, if that's helpful, which it sounds like it will be. And then talking about stakeholders. So we've named a handful. We've got kind of a candidate list based on some earlier conversations, based on our own research. We can share that with you guys, and you can add some notes. I think that would be helpful. And then in terms of outreach and engagement, these would be some great questions to go through that we have. So we are at 8:09. Is there an planned adjourn time for this meeting? Seemed like they were usually between 60 and 90 minutes, hour and a half.
We said 90.
Okay.
Amber, can you tell me who are the stakeholders? Who does that involve?
Sure. So the stakeholders of this process, of this park, are basically anyone who has an interest in the park and the process of getting the park together. So that means us, we're all stakeholders. I'm a stakeholder from the design side. You guys are stakeholders from the Parks and Recreation Board side. Sometimes a stakeholder is the person who supports the money for the park. Sometimes a stakeholder is an individual who, lives next to or does business next to the park. So we know that the stakeholder list is broad. And that's why when we get that stakeholder list together, we'll start to think about what's the correct level of engagement. I think what you mentioned about the Beach Drive owners and the Civic Club, we may appreciate that they have an outsized interest in this park's impact to traffic. But we may also understand that they are not, they don't have more influence over what happens in the park than the rest of the citizens of Lake Forest Park. But we do understand that there will be impacts to them. There's going to be construction on the street. There's going to be more people on this project, on this site potentially than we're. And so that would be a reason to do direct engagement to make sure that we get to them and their concerns in a special dedicated space. And we do have room for that in the scope. We do have a scope item for essentially direct engagement meetings. And so those would be when there becomes an opportunity that says, hey, this neighbor, this business, this whoever, this agency, sometimes it's, Fish and Wildlife, or it's the Audubon Society, or it's, whoever, they need to have a special conversation so that we can get to their concerns, so that we can keep the community meeting on track and make sure that the community members get the attention that they need. So we do have a device for that. And so your recommendations of who those groups might be, sounds like we have 2 already, Beach Drive residents and Civic Club. So we can work with Corey to get those staffed. So who would be the right people from the consultant team to address those? We do have an environmental planner, we have a geotechnical engineer, so we could speak to the sedimentation. So those might be good people to be present at that meeting. And then of course we'll get those scheduled with the contacts of the organization.
Will there be a standard overview presentation pre-charrette so that a Parks Board member or a council member could go to the Stewardship Foundation or Friends of Third Place or a community, Sheridan Beach Club or whoever, and do a presentation, but they don't have to invent it. And I think pre-charrette would be good, because then what you're doing is people are like, why is there a charrette when I didn't know anything about what was going on? So reaching out, or it could be Corey who does it, or someone from from the city? It could be any number of people, but will there be a package like that?
Yeah, so we call that a pre-engagement toolkit,
Okay.
right? And so
Thank
it
you.
basically, no worries.
The pre-engagement toolkit.
Right, so it basically gives you guys a little snippet, snapshot of information that you can share these groups that you're members with, the groups that may invite you to present to them in that outreach that you're doing, so that you feel, prepared and informed and all of that to have those conversations. And yes.
And I'm curious about the best timing for those. I'm thinking about the PTA, for instance.
Oh, sure. Mhm.
Best timing for that to be able to provide useful input into this process.
Right, well, so there's useful is an interesting word. So I think anytime that we're getting information, we're making sure that we're responding to that information, not necessarily through a direct email. We got your comment, we're gonna address it this way. But more like, does this mean that we need to pivot as a design team? Does this mean that the design changes? So for example, we are expecting the architect to do an assessment of the structures. We're expecting a cultural resource inventory. We're expecting, as these bits of information come in, we're gonna have to say, this changes something, And so we need to respond to that information as it's coming in. So I would say that there's not a point in the process where their input isn't useful, but there are definitely points in order to keep the project moving forward where, their information can help to frame and make a decision. At any point, if they say something that requires us to make a change, like, oh, this happened in a recent project. You don't actually own all of this property, was the news that we got. Clearly, doesn't matter when that news comes, we respond to it, and it needs to be addressed right away. So at any point, again, if this is something, the PTA, they may want to comment on the types of, programs that might use a community space. They might want to offer a letter of support. They might want to have very specific, conversations about open hours and that type of things, responding to outer school, after school programs. That's all really great feedback. And if you can get to them early in the process, fantastic. If it comes a little bit later, that's still great, because this project is going to be going on for a little while. Yeah. So we will get you guys that pre-engagement toolkit early on. Yes, the meeting is coming up soon, or what we have is the timing of the meeting is coming up soon, but we are used to that type of timeline. And so, pulling this stuff together, our goal is to get the survey online within the first weeks of September. So we've got a good several weeks of it, 3 to 4 or 5 weeks of it out and getting information, so that we then at the community meeting can say, here's what we've heard already. And so this is how it's informed what we're bringing to you today. And how we can keep moving that conversation forward. Does it mean we're going to take the survey down? Not necessarily. It may mean that we watch, more results and things come in. And that's actually why we have things like the engagement website, so that people can continue to, I just moved here and I want to get up to speed. They can get all the notes, do all the exercises, put in their feedback, and we can continue to catch people up in the process. So,
Okay, this
yes.
may not be the right, you may have this on your mind already, but it's occurring to me, and it's a half-formed thought that I've had as these discussions have been going on, that because the Civic Club is right there, and that's deeded access to the Civic Club. So there are people who, there's part of the town that is by deed member and has access to the lakefront now. And there's part of the town that doesn't. And there's not a coherent identity, or, the Civic Club, you can go and do a presentation of the Civic Club. But there are a lot of people who don't currently have either through the Beach Club or the Civic Club beachfront access at all. And I would think that a major goal here is that to serve especially that population and to get their feedback on what they would like out of it. And some of that can be done by analogy to the Civic Club and the Beach Club, but I put it out into the room that we should all be thinking about how to make sure that we're getting that feedback from people who in some cases may be renters, or other ways less, they have different civic engagement than other parts of the community. So I'm sure that that's on your radar already, but I just wanted to say it out loud.
I think it's good in the survey to find out, do you have access to the 2 beach clubs, to one or the other of the 2 beach clubs? Because then we can weight the information from the people who don't have access to either
Even
beach
if you
club.
have access, isn't that still a membership fee every year? So just because they have access doesn't mean they can afford membership.
You have to pay it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
You don't have a choice. No, you have to pay the fee. You don't have a choice to join or not join.
Yeah,
It's not like
Not
an
even
HOA where
charity.
you can't Right.
not in Sheridan Beach at least. It's part of the
More like
HOA
HOA dues.
requirements, yeah, so I didn't realize.
Yeah, the Civic Club is not.
So how much is it a year?
Like $300.
Oh, that's a lot,
It's been more
Yeah.
recently because of the
yeah,
shoreline.
that is a lot. Okay, so the question has to be, are you a member? Yeah,
And it's also different if you want boat access.
yeah. It's at the beach, at Sheridan Beach, it's different if you want to join the pool. That's an extra charge, but you have access to the water. Anyway, so that's just, I hope that's useful information.
Absolutely. So what
Yeah.
we typically do is we'll draft the questions, we'll come up with a test link for the survey, we'll share that to the city, and so you can share that with the Parks Board for a quick run through. And then that way we can have you guys review the questions before your survey results count, actually. So, okay.
For that survey, so you've already got this to, we've done 1,000 of these. But is there any exercise the survey taker can do to like rank or put in order their priorities for what the park would have?
Yes,
Like,
absolutely.
way to, like,
Yeah.
say, you want water access or a playground, or like, where would you, how would you rank those? Adequate parking?
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways you can ask questions, you know, open form, multiple choice, ranked choice. Yeah, there's a number of different formats. So we employ different ones depending on what the question is and the, you know, telling the information that we're trying to get back. So I think if it works for you guys, since we're talking about engagement, it sounds like tools and measures that can improve community participation specific to Lake Forest Park, the surveys have been particularly successful.
Yes.
Great.
And recently in the last couple of years, yeah, I mean, as long as they're short, but I think also if you can comment on each question.
Yeah.
That we got a lot of very specific feedback through those comments and,
Right.
I think in addition to letting people know through the city website, they used other, shoreline area news, and I don't know if they use Nextdoor. Maddie Larson would know, Corey. Cause she kind of orchestrated. Oh, yeah, same thing. The Climate Action Committee had great response to their survey.
Okay.
So
Do we need to somehow limit this to Lake Forest Park residents?
I think you make them
Say it.
both of these surveys asked, are you a resident of Lake Forest Park?
Okay, so we did, Corey shared with us early on some of the other community outlets. There was an e-news, there was a quarterly newsletter, shoreline area news. Are there other outlets that you think would be helpful or advantageous? You mentioned Nextdoor. I know you have to be a member of that, but we can
I'm
coordinate.
not a big fan of
Did it on
Nextdoor.
all of our social media outlets.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Great.
I also feel like this is where we come in, but WhatsApp groups, you know, I'm on like Lake Forest Park Moms WhatsApp group. And it's probably 200 people.
Yeah,
So like that, if there are things that I can text out.
excellent. Yes, yeah, so.
PTA.
Yeah, PTA newsletter.
You can send the link to the survey as a,
Yeah.
that's like a really good early effort, and I was just amazed at the volume of response that we got.
Right. And so what we would do is we would be sharing that information, you know, to the city staff. Corey would be sharing with you guys, and then we would look at you guys as being part of that distribution to your network, whatever channels you're tapped into. Okay, any other measures? So what about things like posters, postcards, mailings? We have, you know, the community space at Third Place Books. We've got some great poster displays there. It seems like it's always a really active, engaged space. And so have you noticed that those types of things tend to do well? Engaging print media, maybe not. Okay.
I will say, okay, so we ran yoga in the park and we did like zero outreach. It went in all social media, and then a couple posters around town, and we got tremendous. Excellent. So I do think posters make a difference. I think just things in the town center and then outside the library. Because I'm not sure how people have that.
Even at parks, you know, a little, yeah. And sending people to the website on the survey, of course. So, you know, I think if it has,
Signage Park.
yeah,
With little QR code. on it.
postcards, no.
Okay. And then we also were recommended potentially a water bill insert. That will-
Amy, you're muted. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. I'm sorry, Lori, I disagree. I think a mailing is a great idea. I think people see they still look at their mail. And not everybody's online, not everybody they're just overwhelmed with email and stuff like that. I think everything here, but I also think that a postcard or a mailing to the community would be very powerful.
Doesn't the city have is it monthly? I feel like it's something that was daily. Okay.
So we
So
could,
we
put it-
could-
we could put it in the quarterly newsletter with kind of maybe a mock-up of the miniature version of the poster.
Postcard is also nice for reaching underserved populations who might not, whether it's, for whatever reason, might not be getting all the same.
Does that get particularly expensive?
It's a cost, those cards are, it's.
It's
cost.
thousands of dollars, so that's why I think if we could include like a postcard in the e-news.
Yeah.
That's already going out, that would be, and that goes out to all residents, so that would be, I think, a cost-effective way to do it.
I just want to say, do people get their water bill on paper? Is that?
I don't,
I don't know about that, no.
We only do sewer. Okay,
I don't.
or
get
I guess it was
paid one.
utility bills. which
Yeah.
are-
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I get that. I get that.
Yeah,
okay. Okay, so maybe not on this one.
But it is capturing that group that you're not capturing digitally,
that could be,
so.
yeah,
Casting that to those.
that could be, yeah,
Sure,
that's a
yeah.
good reason.
Yeah. Okay,
Probably also wouldn't get renters, the utility, right?
Yeah.
Probably just go to a landlord.
It usually goes.
Yeah,
Depends on the lease.
yeah. It's,
Okay.
there's also the fly shop and the birding shop. I know that they do a bird walk along the store does, there are other bird walks around. But those are not, and then obviously the Burkillman Trail that is there, so there are bike groups. I don't know if it's worth doing outreach to Cascade Bike Club, or if there are other more local.
right, so I
Bike
think that
groups.
would be some of that, the pre-engagement toolkit type stuff, where we're saying, here's the flyer, here's the QR code, here's the survey, here's the tagline, and then everyone is posting it to social media channels, everyone's sharing it to their groups. I think the postcards in town center, knowing that they do a birding walk, in that area, that, sharing a poster with each of those businesses could be a good thing. Because again, it's about getting people to see that QR code and scan it and go to, go to the website, to do the activities of the survey.
And maybe some sort of something at that intersection,
Mhm.
just because again, the Burke Gilman,
Right.
there's a lot of people moving through that space and
Right.
Stopping.
stopping there, right? Yeah, and there's a chance to actually like take a picture of something
There
or.
is anxiety in the community about the broader public using the waterfront park. I mean,
I use Logboon Park.
me
I
too,
can't feel
so
bad about.
I just wanted to share that thought, it is not my thought, but there is that thought. When we bought the waterfront park, we got a certain amount of feedback, like, why are you doing this, it's just gonna cause the city trouble.
And we have 4 more questions.
I do.
Move us ahead.
So does the public have any preconceived notions about the park? And this would actually be concerns as well. So, are there expectations, are there attitudes that are prevailing that we'll either need to, tap into, or contend with and mitigate? So it sounds like the concern about, attracting too many visitors.
I think it might be a minority view, but I have
Okay.
heard it.
Or more local, I think would be just general safety and security.
Yes.
Or noise and parking in that neighborhood.
The immediate next door neighbor is there, because it's his yard and he has a small daughter. He's very concerned about security and privacy along the border. So it's the Civic Club, Lion Creek Park, the Lakefront Park, and then his house. And so I think traffic can be addressed, security he's very concerned about, because people could just walk over on the beach front, right, to his yard, so how do you secure his property from trespassers and noise? So I just wanted to mention that, those are 2 negative feedbacks I've gotten. Positive, a lot of people are positive, right? These are, I'm only giving you.
I've had the posters out at the bands, the farmers market, and
Mhm.
I've only had good feedback so far.
I think that's the vast majority.
I talked with a lot of people about it at yoga in the park, and the only negative thing I heard was one woman who was really concerned about the herons in Lake Creek, so environmental impacts. And then a lot of people really excited about public space, public access to the beach, community space. Folks are really excited. There is a group of folks who I know and love who are really committed to making it Octavia Butler Park after one of our more famous residents. And so that's a preconceived notion, is what this park is going to honor and do in our community.
So the nice thing about, this process, and something that came at the urging of the city council, was that we do a thorough interpretive planning process. So we'll do an interpretive plan. We'll be looking for some of those themes. So, what's particular and unique about the history of Lake Forest Park and how it relates to this site, and how can that be brought forward from the design? Naming is one way, but there are a lot of other ways. So that's wonderful to hear some of that feedback. I know you guys just named the street after Octavia Butler.
Yeah, I don't know that.
Hi. If I may butt in, I wanted to raise some the third item, concerns about attracting too much traffic to the park. I feel like this is the park is supposed to be open to everyone. So I think we're raising this. I think there's a need to clarify what does that exactly mean, concerns about attracting too much traffic. I am a heavy park user. I visit with my child and my husband. We go to Log Boom almost every day and we love it. And we are heartened that it has been improved, and kudos to DCG for doing a great job. Every day you see people from I know everywhere coming to the park, appreciating the features of the park. And I feel like when we develop this lakefront property, it should also be it should also it's natural that it would attract the same people. People who are going to Log Boom will be interested. Oh, there's another lakefront park, and it will be closer to the town center. And I'm looking at it from a perspective of someone who's a person of color, and this statement kind of concerns me because it sounds exclusionary. It's like, oh, okay, what does that mean? Am I not welcome if I'm a person of color or I don't look like a resident of Lake Forest Park? I'm not welcome to that park. I just want everybody to be mindful of the wording, because it might be offensive, and I want Lake Forest Park to be a welcoming. This is what we are welcoming, and this statement is not very welcoming. It doesn't feel very welcoming to me. So I just wanted to point it out. So
I think that's a great comment. I think there, in terms of what I thought that I was hearing, was not necessarily that it would not be welcoming, but what would be almost a cost on the landscape and the experience. If there was the allowance in the design for it to be almost overused. So we have a lot of conversations about reciprocity in landscape stewardship. So not just how can this park serve the community, but what can the community do to protect and steward this place? So this was a comment that Council Member Furutani mentioned about the need to think about the presence of fish, but also the potential for the future increased use of Lion Creek. And that whatever the use of this property should be, we shouldn't forget about that. And I think a really good example of how this could look in a design solution is, for example, the name of the adjacent park is Lion Creek Waterfront Preserve. And so when you see the sign and walk into the park, it does talk to you a little bit about your behavior. It's a waterfront preserve. And so it says right in the name what the park is about and what the behavior should be. And so I think if we think about this being the Gorge Amphitheater, it kind of amps you up. If it's something else, it starts to describe what the behavior is. And sometimes that's also true in just the way that the place is arranged. So if there's a lot of paving, if there's a lot of parking, if there's a really quick shot between, you know, the driveway entrance, the dumpster, and then the boat ramp, there's sort of a prescription of your action and your use of the place. And I think we can be intentional in terms of how can we make sure that the place is welcoming, but make sure that the activity that we're welcoming is to the scale of what the landscape can handle. I guess is that at all maybe a helpful interpretation of that?
Yeah, and I also want to I understand the concern that you know, the Civic Club has with regards to, you know, what was raised here. I wanted to bring up that there I read in a Facebook account for Lake Forest residents. There's a teacher at Lake Forest Park Elementary School who was concerned about the kids who were not members of the Civic Club not having a place to not having access to the lakefront and having to go to Log Boom is too far away, and so it would be, she was advocating that somehow there would be a way that the Civic Club would open up to the rest of the non-deeded residents in the city to have access to the lakefront, and that is part of Lake Forest Park. And I think this project, I'm excited for it because this is the answer to that. We now have a park, lakefront park that everybody has access to, that is not exclusive to members of the Civic Club, is not exclusive to the members of the Beach Club. And it's bigger, and it's not as, you know, restrictive as what we have currently with the honey, what do you know, what's the name of the park? Lion Creek. Yeah, Lion Creek. Lion Creek is it, you can't bring your dog, you can't swim, although I've seen people swim, but you know, it's generally residents are respectful of the restrictions about the usage of Lion Creek. And with the property being more open and more like the Civic Club, it's something that I know residents look forward to.
So I think that does transition well to our next question, which is, have community members or others been promised anything? And I think it seems like a lot of the discussion about this park has been that public place that is not exclusive and is not membership restricted, that this would be a place for everyone
To access the lake.
to access the lake.
That Lake
Yeah.
Forest Park will actually have lake access 100 years in.
I do want to echo what Richie said, that there is a lot of gathered sort of feelings about the private clubs in like Forest Park. And I feel like that's going to always be sort of the backdrop and the context that we're talking about, that some people love their clubs, some people can't be in the club, some people can't access the clubs for many different reasons, and that's just sort of the context that this is happening against. So
And directly next door to.
and directly next
Another
door to,
go on it. Yeah, it's really interesting.
yeah.
And with the risk then
You wrote
of
down the
comparison,
community
of it
space
being,
option on
you know,
the
oh, that's
overall
where these people
stuff.
go and this is where
And
those people go. You don't want that.
But I think people are expecting some, they don't know what it is, some version of community space because they've heard about the buildings. Mhm.
So there is some expectation that there'll be a community space exclusive to buildings, but it's not defined.
Not at all.
So we do have a question about what are some of the, barriers or obstacles to community support. And I do think that that tension that you're describing between the adjacent club, that honestly, if we took that program and put it on this site, that is what many, many waterfront parks look like. The difference is who can get into one and who can get into the other. It sounds like, the vision for this is something new and different than what's offered next door. It's not an equivalent experience. And so if you're a member of one, there's something else that's here and a reason that you would choose to go to the public park because of, the other community aspects to it. And so I think that dynamic of, this relationship between what is a private street because it's a private club and it's private homes, and a very quiet park with a limited program of use, no water access, no parking. I didn't realize dogs were not allowed, but that's definitely a program limitation. So those number of things, and then what this may be. So I imagine there's actually quite a lot of fear potentially about, are we going to lose the character of this street and the character of the existing park to the unknown of what this could be, and the adjacent example, which is very lively. There's the vehicular boat ramp, there's the playground right at the shoreline. There's a lot of presence there, and it is very different, I think, than what this could be.
But I think also, I mean, to the point, I think Richie's point, but what I was thinking also before of the many people in the community who don't have access to one of those clubs, that there is a need there that is not being served, and that this should serve that same need for that, at least for that part of the community, if not also, people who have access to the clubs will go where they choose.
Right.
It should appeal to them, right? It should be in competition in that way. In my mind, it's trying to serve that need for people who don't have those other two places.
So it
And
could
should
be
be
similar,
no
it doesn't have to
first.
be, I think, dramatically different, right? If it provides some of the opportunities that people who can't go to the civic club would like to see.
And then again, Civic Club has
Yeah.
a boat ramp, which this won't have. The
Yeah.
Beach Club has a pool, which this I
Yeah.
assume won't have.
Yeah.
So there will be some other way to distinguish it.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
and that's reasonable. And
But waterfront recreation and community space.
Yeah.
Are kind of the two main things I'm are thinking about.
And that's part of where thinking about the survey results of what do people who are not members of those already, what would they be looking for the most in the lakefront access? I assume that it's going to be largely similar, but I don't know. Sure.
I think that's exactly right. That's what we need to figure out.
Okay, and then, so are there any other obstacles that we see that could be barriers to community support of the project?
Cost to implement and maintain will be an issue, just because of our sales parts levy. So we may have people raise that issue again, or maybe not, I don't know, hard to say.
Something that can be helpful with those cost conversations is showing rather than telling.
Yes.
Trust me, it's gonna be great, goes over really different than having a beautiful visual that sort of comes out of this process. So I think that's a great thing for us to work towards, is building, you know, the perception of value in terms of what the return will be, and that this is an investment in the legacy of the town.
I agree, because I think that was one of the criticisms previously, is, you know, that we didn't know exactly what we were voting for. Also.
One thing that when I talk to people about this, that they get really excited about is the idea of community events happening. So in terms of a strategy of selling it, people want to hear that there's going to be music, there's going to be dancing. Like, this is why I think Third Place Commons is such a great partner to think about programming down there. All kinds of youth stuff going on. So really thinking about this as a really vibrant new space for the community. So lake access and all of that, but like through the winter, you're gonna want to go here, right?
It's a great spot.
Good point.
I'm gonna add a new slide here for vision. So this is a question that I wanted to ask you guys, but I know we're short on time, so it's pretty, we're gonna get to it. But so in terms of what, you know, if you've been to the park, you've been, you know, on the property currently, you know, standing in that space, how does it feel, and how do you want it to feel? You know, I think some of the language that you just used, you know, vibrant, a place where people want to gather, a place where it becomes, you know, a community center of outdoor and waterfront recreational activities. And it sounds like there is a community scale there that you're talking about, you know, where things like yoga in the park, things like, you know, some of the voting groups, that type of thing, can gather and feel like they're occupying the space rather than it being, you know, a massive park space where you kind of get lost in the crowd, which seems like that was some of what has been described, you know, the venues where hundreds of people show up, and it's a little bit different. So can you talk more about that, or do any of you have some of these ideas for where you're kind of imagining that a successful outcome of this would be from an experience standpoint, a finished park?
A band shell is something that had occurred to me also, not as an actual thing, but like to that same sense of, you know, that it is a community civic space for where, yes, you know, people are playing in the summer, they're barbecuing, all of that, but that there is an opportunity for those more formal community events.
So it sounds like both formal and informal use is something that would be, you know, you could kind of show up and with a birthday party, you can show up with family reunion, or there can be a more sponsored event that's more specifically programmed. So that type of flexibility, it sounds like. So maybe where, you know, often what we'll see there is that you can program the space where it's one focused use, you know, an event, or you can, it still works if there's people who just showed up and then there's 2 or 3 birthday parties going on, and people are playing frisbee or whatever it is, that it feels right that, you know, to host multiple groups versus a single.
I'm not sure where this fits in here, but the reality is the governor of all of this is going to be access, right? So when we think about the realities of like parking and traffic and whatever, is it wise for us to define that as early as possible so that we understand that if that's kind of a governor on how people get there, is how they also engage with it?
So some of that is going to respond to what are we doing here. So some of that is the group that is the Institute for Transportation Engineers. They have very specific rules and guidelines about how you need to park in places. So we do have a transportation engineer on the team who's going to be speaking to these issues and engaging specifically about them at the pre-design charrette, and we'll be talking at community charrettes about that and doing that research. If we were to say take this and turn it into a wedding venue, the parking needs and the reality of carrying and walking across 522 would be very different than if it becomes something like would make for great photos, but it's going to be very different than if this is a room like this in that building that is kind of flexible and portable, and you can change and use for different spaces. You could host a small wedding there, waterfront could be nice, but there's also, it's not a designated use where all of a sudden that starts to guide the catering kitchen and the accessibility and all of these things. So some of that we could either ask for the transportation engineers now, but the truth is he's going to have to respond to what the program goal is. And then there's going to be things that we have to meet and things that are good to have. For example, you know, if it's a movie theater, it's gotta be parked X amounts of spaces per seats in the theater. If it is not, there's flexibility. If it's a use that is a combination of a couple things, they're allowed to make an argument. And some of that might be that there's cooperative parking with City Hall. Some of it might be that we're anticipating a lot of the traffic to arrive by walking and transit. But again, this is all gonna follow from why are people coming?
And you're basing this on permitting or what's the,
Sure.
just to understand
Yes.
where is this constraint coming? It's permitting.
So yes, so
From the
usually.
city and state.
Yeah, so usually from the city, from the local code would be that we do a transportation study and that the parking that's provided is consistent with the use based on the guiding rule, the standard, which is often the Institute for Transportation Engineers. And there are, you know, deviations to that. So for, I don't want to speak in too many examples because I tend to do that in the use of time, but yeah, so there are creative solutions that transportation engineers can do by watching the traffic and by, you know, saying based on the attitudes and the other options that are here, we can underpark this, or, you know, based on what we know the use is going to be, we need to over. There's those types of things.
But based on Steve's comment, I just want to say, there's only a certain number of spaces at City Hall.
Right.
So that, and I don't think we're expecting to take over more spaces. So to some extent, and there is always, you know, whatever you call it, take park and ride parking, or people using the private parking.
Somebody will have to talk to the.
That we'll have to talk to them about, but I think at least considering what the limitations are and how that would fit makes sense.
Oh, yeah, it seems so hyper tactical, but within this situation, it seems to me that it's like got a few things that could really drive a lot of
What is the,
what this.
there's gonna be like a code capacity, how many people can even be in the building, so that's kind of limit.
Right.
Start, so.
Agree. And there will also be things like, you know, there's buffers on this site, you know, I mean, when they built the locks, the lake level, you know, dropped by 9 feet. And so most of the half of the site used to be lake bottom, you know. So there are a number of reasons why it would not be good to put parking there. For one, it's a park, so we don't want to cover it with parking, you know, and anywhere that we put parking and that it's impervious, we have to provide stormwater for that. So now we've taken, you know, what is a 9 by 20 foot parking space, and then we've built an equivalent stormwater. So we've got that much room from the park gone, not used for the public.
I liked your idea of a pull-up space rather than a parking space, except for what we need for disability access, but of a pull-up space, so you can pull up and drop people off, but then they're kind of semi-blocked off from the neighborhood, so you have to kind of turn around. That I thought made a lot of sense for both access, but dealing with the fact that you can't really have parking.
Right, I mean,
As part of the
if you
property.
imagine how people are gonna, you know, use it, if it's me in a kayak, I'm either portaging it across 522, or I'm coming there, I'm dropping it off, I'm putting it in a rack, and parking my car, and then I'm coming back. And so how do we get that sequence going? But there's also a visitor behavior thing, so we can use traffic as a wayfinding device. You know, people are either going up and down Beach Drive looking for parking, or we can come up with some solution, which is what we were trying to explore there, of how you would essentially direct people to, this is the park and now you're turning around. You know, because that's really what it would be. So I think there are definitely things that we could do to look at parking, because access is a big thing. But
We
access
can make local access only, and we can also have permit parking for the neighbors. If it really gets bad, we can make residential parking, so.
Those
It's
are,
worth thinking about whether there's a way to do like a community shuttle, or, and because it's right by the Burke Gilman Trail, you know, how to encourage bike access.
well, and that's a good example of something that we can make a recommendation in this process, but it would not necessarily be our task, you know, based on the scope that we have to, in this phase, develop a shuttle access program. But I think that's a great idea of what we can accommodate in our traffic study, which would be that there is a bay that's long enough for a shuttle, that there is a turnaround that's wide enough for, you know, we know we have to meet fire, we know we want to meet school buses, but if there is a community shuttle vehicle already that we can use to influence the turning radii and how that is laid out, that can make it that much easier for the city to take those steps in the future because the infrastructure is already there. So again, there's gonna be, you know, the back and forth of those types of ideas.
Unless you consider a police car, community shuttle.
That's a one-way trip. Huh?
It's the community van.
Oh, right, the van. We buy them used from richer cities. The van we bought from Kirkland.
Okay, so local access. And then, or. Okay,
Would it
those are
be,
great mitigation.
would it be useful to ask in our survey, you know, you use this park, how would you get there?
Yes, that was actually, that's
that
one
on
of the
there?
draft comments that were, yeah, our draft questions that we were thinking of is, you know, how would you get there? And then, you know, what do you intend to do there? Because lots of people may ride the bus, but they're probably not riding with watercraft. And so if our main group is paddlecraft individuals, then, you know, it may be, right. And so then we come up with, what do we anticipate to be that car queue and how we can't back it up into 522. And so there's those considerations too, which is why we have that expertise on our team. So they'll do all of that stuff. Okay, so, any more ideas on vision? How do we want to feel when we're standing in this space? You guys are all there, where it is being cut. What are people doing? Types of groups are there. What are some of the activities that are happening?
Richie had a comment earlier on this, I think. Sorry, I just wanted to flag that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I envision families with young kids bringing, getting together, enjoying the water. So that's how I see it. It's similar to what I see every day at Log Boom.
And the other thing that you see at the Civic Club all summer long, and our student representative isn't here, so I'll pretend that I'm him for a moment. That you see, you know, middle school and high school kids just on their own going to the Civic Club. And I as I've been thinking about that space, like, oh, that's great. There are a bunch of people who can also, who can't go there, who will have a place to go in the summer. And as Richie mentioned earlier, like the teachers talking about that as like in the summer, it's lakefront, it's where the kids want to hang out. And the more that can be an independent destination, or you know, depending on the age, supervised. But
Yes. So that would be, we would think about safety, right? And we would think about suitability for all ages and abilities.
Yeah.
Okay. And almost a place for kids to be independent.
I mean, you know, it's a community space, so there will be eyes on them. It'll be,
It's not like Animal Acres that sort of spreads out into the city. It's very contained in a way that lends itself to, you know, parents are sitting over there on a blanket, and your kids over there, and it's fine.
yeah, as long as there are sight lines.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have used a lot of your time at this meeting tonight. But I think this is really excellent input in terms of starting to frame what we need to make sure is, you know, articulated and presented at the pre-design workshop. So that would be where we bring, you know, if we know that these are the things that you're thinking of, we want to bring the information to respond to those. A good example of that are what the architect is going to put together. They're basically going to say, you know, these are the structures, this is the type of them, this is how big they are, this is where you be for fire code, and lay out some practical advice and option, and then start to respond to these ideas. What if it's a community space? Well, then that means this. That means then the traffic will type in, that means we need this much parking, and then civil will type in, that means we need this much drainage. So it'll be a very active meeting where we'll be talking about some of this stuff, but the goal will be to sort of test the limits of, okay, we can't go there, but we've got flexibility in there. So let's bring this to the public and get their input. So we're aiming for a constructive process, iterative, keep moving forward, and have all of the, you know, later steps build on the prior. So that is our presentation for today. We do have a handful of things that we want to follow up on, which is, I think that I'll amend the schedule so that it's more specific to this body. And then I will we've got the stakeholder list that's in the engagement plan. I'll modify that based on what we heard today. And then Corey, will you be sending that stuff out to this group? Okay, excellent. Great.
This was a great and energetic jump off. So you covered an awful lot and I really appreciate your expertise and you know, kind of energy you're bringing to this because we do have to run through a lot in a limited amount of time. So
Thank you. I appreciate that. Amy, if Amy's still on the call.
she left.
Okay, if there is anything that I can do to make this less overwhelming, let me know. What's coming through is my excitement and if that, good.
Like any examples, but
Yeah.
you just finish what you handed into, you know, other grants, so that you have an idea. What my head is with some of this is like, sounds like there's a balance of like, there's ways to make this attractive, there could put limitations on the whole thing, so I think that that's where your expertise comes in on these things, and I think having us best understand how we frame that up in a way that makes this, you know, great for the community and also get funded, would be helpful.
Yeah, excellent. I can do that.
Yeah, that's a really good. Where at the end of the day, we want stuff that's going to get funding, right? So features that are attractive for funding opportunities from the state or the county are good to know about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where I assume your expertise helps us.
And a great thing about a lot of these programs is that, you know, one of the biggest things that you can demonstrate is that you asked the community for input, you heard them, and then you responded to it, and then you have demonstrated need in terms of what, you know, the city's planning has been. And so Lake Forest Park has been great in terms of saying, we've been working on this because we listened to the community, and it's been a long time coming, the acquisition of this, and now we've dedicated the resources to do this process right. So already you're starting from a really good position in terms of saying, this is a robust community engagement process. And that really goes a long way. So I think that's, you know, that's a good sign. And then, you know, we'll work with you to make sure that the design is feasible and all of those things. But whether or not they'll be more likely to fund, you know, a playground versus a pickleball court, you know, that just kind of comes down to the funding agency. And so you guys have a lot of flexibility with that. It's actually a lot of money out there to playgrounds. It's very nice. So don't know that there's very many pickleball ones yet, but actually they're right around the corner.
So it sounded like Amy said that we have enough. So.
Yes.
Well, I think those parts.
Yeah.
But playground equipment, that's a good question for the community. Right.
I'd say this has been great. I feel like some of us have been on the parks board for a long time. We're thinking about parks for a long time, and this is, I don't know, sort of the whole point of it, really, is to really get to this point to see this waterfront access come together in a way that we can be a part of, and help the city kind of pull it together in a great way. So thank you for your help.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I mean, we need to get 3 volunteers to be on this pre-design workshop.
Is it a set date?
It'll probably be the 25th or that week.
And is it accurate that
It's
it's
during
during the day?
Do you want them now?
But
Do you want volunteers now?
yeah,
I'd be interested.
okay, we're not.
So it will be a 3-hour in person. That's right, Chuck, 3 hours. 3 hours, yeah, okay, 3-hour in person with the walk. And so the thing that we haven't pinned down yet is that time of the day and then the actual day. So I think having more than 3 is good, because the goal would be that, you know, 3 people can make it. Yeah.
And for open meeting reasons, no more than 3.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Richie, did you hear from that?
I mean, I can volunteer if you need another person.
I'll work with Corey to,
And yeah, and I'll get back
Yeah,
with
we can
the feedback.
work it out. Yeah, that's coming up. Well, I guess there's a little bit more of the.
During the day, I assume that the student member would not be available, but we should make sure.
Depends on the time.
He's on the call.
Oh, yeah, okay. Just kind of.
Yeah, I mean, we can table yoga if you want, or, and picnic in the park on September 9th. If you guys wanna come and volunteer with me at the booth throughout the day.
Is there anything we can do about our immediate prior discussion?
Yeah, I don't know, Amber, if you'll have anything more for me before September 9th for the picnic in the park besides.
We are hoping that we'll have the draft questions to you kind of ASAP after this meeting. And then we'll hopefully get that up so that the new thing on the website and the code will be the surveys front
So
center.
we could have that.
Voting, going to the website, sign up for notices, and then get do the survey. So
We'll have that information at the picnic in the park.
yeah,
That'd be fantastic.
yeah. So I'll send out maybe a volunteer like to the poll, you know, maybe get like one or two for like chunk of time or something. See what it is. And then I can add like a covering little activity that was put on the side for.
I love
kids to
covering.
do. Yeah.
Do you need our input into those questions?
Amber will send it to me, we'll review, and I'll do a quick turnaround with you guys, give you guys a day or two, depending on what we can.
That's helpful. So we'll be ready.
Yeah, so
Be
just
quick
keep
about it.
eyes out for emails from me, but from now on, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that I think this increases our, work, right?
Yeah.
But might also increase how often we meet. So we should keep that in mind.
That's right. An update on the planning director position, we did interview people, and we're moving towards having a new planning director who now will have a broader portfolio and be called Director of Community Development. So I think we had good candidates, and there'll probably be an announcement in September, early September. So pretty good, and we're also in the process of hiring an associate planner, or assistant planner or whatever, some title like that. And an arborist, so we're working, which we may change the arborist position to urban forest manager. So we're working on those staffing changes, but that's gonna be significant, and I think it's gonna bring a lot of new energy to things, so it's pretty exciting. On to public comment, we have no one else attending, but we have a submitted public comment.
Excuse me, I'll read it out. Do I say who it's from? Sure. Okay, it's from Nancy Gorman. In the development and design plan for the new waterfront park, please see suggested items below. Number 1, community center building with education exhibits that art, sustainability, marine biology, local history, with rooms for classes, a free public meeting room / gathering space facing the waterfront. For an example, see the Edmonds Waterfront Community Center with 3 exclamation marks. Sorry, I don't need it. I think that's actually very, very quick.
Yeah.
2 is boat rentals, and she has a parentheses canoe. And then 3, swim and beach area with outdoor shower and bathroom. Thanks for your consideration.
Fantastic.
There's good input.
Yes.
I think that's exactly the kind of input that we're looking for. in this
Yeah.
process, so.
Can we have the printed text of that comment?
Yeah, I'll send it to you. Thank you. Oh, she actually submitted it on the website already.
Excellent.
And I told her, so yeah, I had her send it to me.
Fantastic.
We should maybe get her involved in like both sides of this sort of
Do you
thing.
know about the environmental center at St. Ed's now that's connected with? It's kind of interesting that, development group redid the lodge, but the community really wanted it to be an educational school, like an environmental ed center. And so part of the negotiation to end up having it developed into a hotel was that there would be dedicated educational space. So UW Bothell has a classroom there. So we can go and teach classes there, but part of the agreement is it's also always open to K-12. And it's also always open for research, like on the land and like for community groups to meet. So I don't know, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here. It's an interesting model that really pulled together a lot of different constituencies. And it's a cool space with lots of people kind of moving in and out of it all the time.
That's great. So those types of local precedent examples that ring true to the spirit of what you may want to, have here are great, because rather than me kind of making up an example to try and illustrate a point, we can pull from these, precedent examples that people in the community either may know or have been to or go visit. It's very, very helpful. So that type of information is fantastic.
I don't think they've done this yet, but the plan is to have camp there, right? They were advertising the
They're-
condition for it, they wanted someone with experience running camps, so.
Yeah.
I inferred that.
Yeah. It is like UW Bothell like kind of owns the classroom, but I think it's an agreement that 50% of its time is K-12 education. So it's really collaborative. Yeah.
No other public comments? All right, so with that, we can keep chatting. Feel free, but we are going to adjourn, wrap up the meeting, so thank you for your time. We're adjourned. We'll be in touch about scheduling future